Well, good afternoon, and in the interest of time, because we only have an hour, we'll get started. Just wanted to, at the top, welcome you to this side event on geoengineering and human rights. It's a side event that's organized by the Center for International Environmental Law and co-sponsored by EarthJustice, the Quakers UN Office, Soka Gakkai International, the Third World Network, the ETC Group, and FIAN International. I'm Kevin Whalen. I'm with the Amnesty International. I represent Amnesty at the UN in Geneva. Just at the start, I just wanted to flag a few administrative notes. The UN has decided to retain the requirement to wear masks in conference rooms for the time being, so we do appreciate your cooperation, especially if you're not speaking. Another admin note is that this event is being recorded and live streamed. And the last is that please no pictures or recording from organizations, people who aren't affiliated with the organizers of the event. So to start off, I'd like to introduce the panel that we have today. We have Yves Lador, EarthJustice's representative to the United Nations in Geneva. We have Lily Four, who's the Deputy Director of the Climate and Energy Program at the Center for International Environmental Law. We have Ana Maria Suarez Franco, who's FIAN's representative to the UN, and we will have a brief video statement from Margareta Werwinki Singh, who's Assistant Professor of Public International Law at Leiden University and Senior Lecturer in Environmental Law from the University of the South Pacific in Fiji. So at the outset, I just wanted to start with a brief explanation of geoengineering and a few potential acronyms, because we all love acronyms. So geoengineering refers to a set of large-scale technological interventions in the Earth's natural systems to counteract some of the effects of climate change. So proposed approaches to geoengineering usually fall under the category of solar radiation management with the acronym SRM, or carbon dioxide removal with the acronym CDR. Another way of looking at these interventions is they're targeting land-based, marine, and atmospheric systems. Many carbon dioxide removal approaches rely on something that's called carbon capture and storage, or CCS, as an enabling technology. Geoengineering technologies are largely hypothetical for now, but some carbon dioxide removal approaches are being implemented at small scale, commercialized, and solar radiation management proponents are rapidly moving into real-world experimentation. So this is called solar geoengineering. But at base, these are complicated and large-scale interventions in large, complicated systems. So first, I'd like to turn over to Yves Lador, in part to explain why are we talking about this now. It's partly because of a process to do with the advisory committee. And so perhaps, Yves, you could explain the process about the advisory committee and get us started.
Thank you, Kevin, and good morning to everybody. Indeed, we're talking about this because the advisory committee is to produce a report on this, but to understand why is it coming from the advisory committee, it's interesting to see that this subsidiary body of the Human Rights Council is working on the climate issue here for the second time. But the very first time it started in 2016, and it ended up in 2017, in February 2017, when the advisory committee proposed a report to the Human Rights Council, and in that report, in Annex 4, there was a research project on the question of climate-induced displacement and human rights. Now, this was not followed by the Human Rights Council, but nevertheless, it is a very interesting document to read about climate displacement. And the reason is it has a rather wide approach, but it was not followed up because at the following session of the Human Rights Council, in its 35th session, the Council decided to ask the Office of the High Commissioner to do more specific studies for the people who were displaced or migrating because of the effect of climate change across international borders. So it was a much more focused element, and this was finally the approach followed by the Human Rights Council. So it's the second time that we're seeing the advisory committee coming into this process. But here it was a bit of a surprise the way things were brought in, because the advisory committee has approached and in a way jumped into the process of the discussions for the establishment of a special rapporteur on human rights and climate change. And so actually the advisory committee intervened in the informal negotiation themselves in order to ask to have such a mandate, which is a bit unusual because it's normally advisory bodies, of course, must actually say what they think about these issues, have contact with the negotiators, and express themselves, but not intervene directly into the negotiation process. So it was a bit of a surprise, and it was very nice to see that the core group of countries who were negotiating that, even though it was an interference, decided to take this on board. So there is a mandate for the advisory committee, and they have opened some consultations on this issue, but it was pretty short. And now, since their session in this last summer, they decided to prepare a report for the next meeting. We unfortunately have to say that not all of the elements in the report are totally exact, and particularly when we think about the approach of indigenous peoples, who of course can be directly affected by such a technology and who have not been able yet to have a real discussion. So we must be very clear there has not been any open and clear consultation with indigenous people on this issue. And unfortunately, this is not reflected correctly in the report that has been given by the advisory committee at this moment. So there is an issue on how well are they ready to really do a report right now, considering the very light consultation they had on what, and we will see this in the following intervention, is a very large issue that needs in-depth consultation, in-depth scientific knowledge, and must not be just rushed into a report just in a few months. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Yves. Okay, so that's why we're focused on it now, but I'd like to ask Lily Four to go a little bit deeper on the human rights implications of this issue, so to give us a basic outline of human rights implications of geoengineering.
Thank you, and hello. So in my intervention here, I'll talk through 4 points. I'll briefly explain how geoengineering impacts human rights. More generally, I will talk through 2 quick examples of technological approaches or outdoor experiments that are currently underway. I will elaborate a bit on the concerns around the advisory committee's upcoming report and conclude with a few recommendations. So, since we're looking at technological proposals that are meant to have an impact on our global climate, on our global ecosystems, they're by nature transboundary in their impacts and effects. Some of those effects are irreversible, and therefore all geoengineering technologies and approaches have the potential to undermine fundamental human rights, and all are incompatible with the right to a healthy environment. Actually, climate science, as summarized in the latest IPCC reports, is crystal clear. Geoengineering pushes us into scenarios where we overshoot our temperature targets and delay real climate action. The IPCC also concludes that geoengineering is highly uncertain and risky, that many approaches, especially those relying on carbon capture and storage, are high cost and low potential in terms of actually reducing emissions. And there is a duty for states to use the readily available and proven technologies to comply with their obligations when it comes to climate protection. Geoengineering allows for an easy way out for big polluters. There is currently no vacuum when it comes to regulating geoengineering at the global level, but there is weak governance. In addition to the international law and other legal principles and obligations that apply here, there's also a concrete de facto moratorium on all geoengineering established by the Convention on Biological Diversity already in 2010 and reaffirmed since. And there are additional very strong measures effectively banning some marine-based geoengineering activities established in the London Protocol to the London Convention and also in the CBD. So that's a rough frame, and a lot more could be said. But maybe it's better to look at two concrete examples, especially if you've not heard much about geoengineering. So the first example I want to look at is an experiment run by Harvard, or research project run by Harvard University called SCOPAX, which stands for Stratospheric Controlled Perturbation Experiment. You don't have to remember that acronym. SCOPAX is developing a technology of solar geoengineering, which is called stratospheric aerosol injection. In short, it is the idea of mimicking a volcanic eruption. So basically spraying a fine layer of particulate matter into the higher atmosphere, into the stratosphere, to shield us from sunlight and thus manipulate the radiative forcing levels that reach Earth. It is only, currently exists only in climate models and in the heads of researchers and modelers, but they're planning to go and test it outdoors. They tried to do a test on indigenous Sami controlled territory in northern Sweden a while ago, but that was stopped because of protests, and there had been no prior consultation, let alone free, prior, informed consent of that to go ahead. And why is this type of technology so dangerous and so crucial when looking at geoengineering from a human rights perspective? I think there are both very fundamental substantive risks, but also procedural risks and harms. So the models that have been done around solar geoengineering, around this particular technology, show that it has the potential to affect global precipitation rainfall patterns. So this technology could disrupt the monsoon. It is clear all of the models show there are always winners and losers. And guess where most of the losers are in the models? They're in the tropical regions. But geoengineering proponents say that we need to weigh those risks against, the risks of known effects of climate change and need to take an informed decision. But who can control the global thermostat? Do we actually think that one nation, one military government, one actor, one billionaire could take control of the global thermostat? We actually think that it is a technology that is in principle ungovernable, and actually many scholars and academics agree, and we'll hear of a proposal of a solar geoengineering non-use agreement later from our academic expert on this panel through a video statement. There is also a significant risk called the termination shock. Imagine if we started to spray stratospheric sort of particulate matter into the stratosphere. In order for this to work, we would have to continue to do this for centuries, basically forever, while we find another way to deal with climate change. But imagine there is a change of government somewhere, or a change of mind, and we would suddenly drop that, or a conflict that would stop those airplanes from going up into the sky and delivering those this fine layer. Well, that would create something called a termination shock, where the temperature level would suddenly rise significantly and cause a huge disruption. There's a lot more to be said on procedural grounds. It's disturbing to see that most solar geoengineering experiments are currently planned on or some implemented already on indigenous territories with nowhere any free, prior, informed consent in sight, and also no public oversight. Most of these experiments are self-governed through pledges or self-established governance frameworks. A completely different example is just one technology out of the whole box and suite of carbon dioxide removal technologies. You might have heard of BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. It's a technology that is included in many of the IPCC scenarios. It's also the favorite of many of the big oil companies when they build their energy transition scenarios. It basically combines two problematic parts: bioenergy, which is problematic from a climate and human rights perspective, and carbon capture and storage. And it's imagined at a massive scale, where in a lot of the models and scenarios, the plan is to roll this out over an area much larger than the size of India on a plan, to just have any impact on the climate. But where would that land come from? Where would the water come from? What would happen to biodiversity? What would happen to the people who live off that land? There is no answer to that. This clearly has significant human rights implications for direct water, food, health. It also favors neo-colonial land grabs. On top of that, it actually wouldn't work to lower emissions. So, we could say a lot more. I just picked those two examples to highlight that it's a very diverse set of technologies. But I want to come back to the advisory committee and their planned report that Yves already talked about. In addition to the concerns that Yves raised, just on the substance of what is there or can be seen in the current outline of the report, we must note that the term used in the advisory committee's report is not geoengineering. They're speaking of new technologies for climate protection, which is deliberately vague and misleading, also confusing, and we've seen that in some of the submissions that have come in. It also, it's a question, what is the intention of coming up with a new term instead of building on the working definition established by the Convention on Biological Diversity? The outline presented currently is very biased. It basically assumes geoengineering will happen and will have benefits and only needs to be governed or human rights proved. And discussions so far indicate that the human rights related risks and implications concerning mitigation technologies such as renewable energy projects, which are also real. There are human rights concerns around large-scale renewable energy projects, that they're basically comparable with the risks of geoengineering, even though they're on a completely different scale. We're concerned that is some of the level of debate we've seen in some of the discussions with the advisory committee. So the profound threats and irreversible harms associated with geoengineering are not adequately reflected. So where does that lead us? What are our concrete recommendations going forward? So international climate fora, such as the UNFCCC, and that's the place that many people point to saying, those people have to deal with geoengineering. Well, they're clearly not equipped to fully and adequately address the risks and threats of geoengineering. We've just seen too many times how a sole focus on carbon risks undermining human rights when it comes to climate action. And the UN human rights institutions must take a strong stance to defend against the enormous risks and threats of geoengineering. From the advisory committee, we expect that they will implement meaningful engagement with consultation of indigenous peoples as those currently on the front and fence lines of many geoengineering experiments and projects. And we also expect that they ensure adequate recognition of the profound risks that geoengineering poses to human rights and take into account the fact that they cannot be mitigated. To the Human Rights Council, we call on Human Rights Council members to accept the advisory committee report only if it demonstrably includes an objective analysis of the human rights implication of geoengineering and if it demonstrates effective engagement of and consultation with indigenous peoples. Also want to note at this Human Rights Council session, there is a session scheduled on September 29 that provides the opportunity to ask the advisory committee questions about the process during the interactive dialogue, where we hope that many states will speak out. And finally, let me close by saying that we also invite relevant special procedures to look into this topic as relevant to their mandate. Thank you.
Thanks, Louis, for highlighting some of the human rights implications of these technologies, the reasons for skepticism, as well as some other substantive and procedural issues with the advisory committee process. Now, if the technology works, we have a short video statement, a 4-minute statement from Margareta Werwenke-Singh, and so let's see if that works.
Distinguished delegates, colleagues, friends. On 28 July, the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution which recognizes the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment as a human right, following the recognition of this right by the UN Human Rights Council in October last year. The international recognition of the right to a healthy environment is the culmination of a vibrant global campaign which enjoyed support from states, civil society, legal scholars, and various UN agencies. The UNGA resolution recognizes that the right to a healthy environment is intrinsically linked to the enjoyment of other human rights and references states' obligations on the international environmental law, including on climate change. The right to a healthy environment provides a useful framework for mobilizing action to address the urgent and interconnected threats to health from air pollution, climate change, and environmental degradation. It emphasizes the central role of states in ensuring a safe and clean environment and highlights the importance of public participation and empowerment in the process. This is particularly relevant in the context of geoengineering, potential large-scale manipulation of the environment to mitigate the effects of climate change. Understanding geoengineering through the lens of the right to a healthy environment provides critical insights into whether proposed technologies are compatible with international law, and if not, what actions are needed to prevent its use. The right to a healthy environment is rooted in recognition of the interdependence between the natural environment and the social and economic conditions that human beings must enjoy in order to lead meaningful lives. The logic underlying the proclamation of the right involves recognition that these are mutually constitutive dimensions of human existence, and that they cannot be separated from one another without undermining both. It therefore recognizes the imperative of securing the health of the environment and ensuring that it is free from major threats that could lead to serious and potentially irreversible harm. This is particularly relevant to discussions of geoengineering, because many of these technologies pose direct threats to the environment as well as to human health. They can disrupt the ecological balance that underpins the functioning of ecosystems and the viability of natural species. In this way, they pose significant risks to the livelihoods of local communities that depend on the sustainable use of natural resources. Ultimately, these risks extend to all of humanity. By endangering the environment in this way, geoengineering is likely to erode the very basis of the right to a healthy environment itself. Clearly then, geoengineering is prima facie inconsistent with the right to a healthy environment. The procedural dimension of the right to a healthy environment is also highly relevant to discussions about geoengineering. Here, a concern is that geoengineering technologies would necessarily be implemented in a way that fails to meet the procedural requirements for protecting the rights of individuals and communities affected by such intervention. These problems are likely to become even more acute if speculation about these technologies leads to significant increases in greenhouse gas emissions and other harmful effects on the environment. This would represent a serious violation of the right to a healthy environment, because it would place communities that are already suffering from the effects of climate change at further risk from destructive environmental events in the future. It would also undermine efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in an equitable and sustainable manner by displacing measures aimed at making deep cuts to emissions with technological fixes that simply make the problem worse in the long run. Such a course of action violates the fundamental principles of human dignity and environmental stewardship that underpin the right to a healthy environment. For these reasons also, geoengineering is incompatible with the right to a healthy environment. The question that arises is what is required of states to prevent violations of the right to a healthy environment connected with geoengineering. To enhance insight into possible responses, a group of legal and governance scholars is looking at prohibitive regimes in international law that are currently in place. For example, the regimes in respect of nuclear proliferation and chemical warfare, to consider how we might develop an international legal framework for a prohibition on the development of geoengineering technologies. Our starting point will be an assessment of how the principles of these prohibitions might be applied to geoengineering technologies, in particular solar geoengineering. This work builds on prior research on governance and the regulation of geoengineering technologies over recent years, which explains why solar geoengineering is ungovernable and must be banned. This research has culminated in a call for an international non-use agreement in solar geoengineering. The proposed non-use agreement would comprise at least 5 core measures and commitments. First, no public funding. Second, no outdoor experiments. Third, no patents. Fourth, no deployment. And fifth, no support in international institutions. The call for the non-use agreement is supported by over 350 academics from around the world, as well as by dozens of civil society organizations. A search for solar geoengineering non-use agreement will bring you to our homepage, and I encourage you to read the academic journal article and other resources listed there, and to consider signing the open letter if you have not already done so. Thank you.
Great. Well, now we've had an explanation of geoengineering, an examination of geoengineering through the lens of the right to a healthy environment, and a brief explanation of the solar geoengineering non-use agreement. I'm going to turn the floor over in a minute, but before I do, I just want to say that we are on time for this side event, and there's the hope that there will be space for question and answer. So after the next panelist, I really do hope that we'll get some questions. But now I'd like to hand the floor over to Ana Maria Suarez Franco and ask her to discuss how geoengineering may impact different communities, including peasants and indigenous people.
Thank you very much, Kevin, and especially thank you for the other organizers and for our speakers, because in fact we are entering into new terrain. I imagine that I am not the only one that is beginning to approach this very technical and complicated topic, and to have this kind of explanations is very helpful. I begin recognizing my low knowledge on the topic, but FIAN has been active in the debates that are happening in other spaces like CPD or the Committee on Food Security, together with others that have much more knowledge, like for example the ETC Group, Center for Biodiversity in South Africa, the People's Health Movement, and of course the International Planning Committee, which is the group of rural movements working on food sovereignty. I would like to begin emphasizing on something that Lily said, we have already been seeing other impacts of the agro-industrial food system that have impacted greatly on our nature and are putting in danger not only the right to healthy, safe and healthy environment, but also the right to food and the different rights that are protected in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Peasants and other people working in rural areas that of course recognize indigenous people's rights that are enshrined in ARM. And we think that these damages are due to the impact on ecosystems and biodiversity, but also have an impact on the social fabric. It also has cultural and social impact. It creates displacement, it creates also migration, and therefore it's about almost all rights being in danger here. And we think that it's very important to take into account that if indigenous peoples and other rural communities as farmers or fishers, pastoralists are affected, we are affecting those who, according to the FAO, are producing food for more than the 70% of the world. In times where in every country we are speaking about a food crisis and an environmental crisis. So this is serious, right? For the rural movements, which is a big sector, and also for environmental defenders, similar experiments as the so-called nature-based solutions, in the reality are more of the same medicine, a medicine that does not really reduce the emissions, but is more or less an experiment to increase the profit for many who have the interest in these new experiments with humanities. And we think that therefore, as Lily said, the first homework should be done first, and it is to reduce emissions and also to work on the basis of other kinds of solutions that peasants and indigenous peoples communities have been contributing with, like agroecology, that are more safe and can also have a great impact without bringing us on these big risks. Here we are speaking about our nature, our food, and our people. And the UN Charter and the Human Rights Covenants including the soft law that interprets them, as for example these declarations that I mentioned, are obliged to take all the adequate measures to ensure that in the adoption of new technologies, as geoengineering, human rights are respected and put over other interests, including corporate interests. In times of multidimensional crisis, this is a must. And I think the example that Lily gave, the second one, in which it's clear that we would have problems on land, would increase the tension. We already have many problems on land in many countries in the world. Bringing these kind of experiments could bring more tension and more problems for governance in the different member states. And of course, this would affect surely more the most marginalized and powerless communities that do not have a voice in this kind of world decisions taken by powerful organizations and people. In order to take any decision on geoengineering, states shall not only be based on impartial science that is free from vested interests, and I want here to recall the last report of the Special Rapporteur on toxics and waste, developing the right to science and explaining that we have a problem of partiality, we have a problem of the voices of the people not taken into account, but also to take into account the voices, the participation of indigenous peoples, peasants, fisher pastoralists, and agricultural workers, for example. And for that, there are platforms that are already working on the topic. Like, for example, the civil society mechanism of the Committee on World Food Security and those working around the CBD. So we need, for these discussions, to learn from what other spaces are have been discussing, like setting the bridges between Geneva and Rome. This would be important for states to request to those who are recommending for very quick decisions. We call you to take carefully the issue of geoengineering, protecting us and our planet from any damage that such technologies could cause on human rights and the environment. And we think that the extreme technical aspects make that you states, member states, are extremely careful. Our nature and our humanity do not resist more experiments with our ecosystems and with the people. In this crisis especially, states shall respect our rights and prevent present and future generations from any eventual damage or loss, ensuring intergenerational justice in their territories, but also globally. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna, for that perspective. Now we have time. We have at least 10 or 15 minutes. So I'd like to open it up to any questions or comments that folks might have. I see Mexico.
Thank you very much for organizing this event, and thank you very much to the panelists for your views on the human rights impacts of geoengineering. We consider this a very relevant topic that we should be discussing upon the implications that it could have on human rights. And in some cases, some technologies, they are just being developed and being tested or to be tested, but in other cases, they, for instance, with CCUS, carbon capture, usage and storage, I mean, that's something that's already, technology has been tested. Some countries even have legislation on that. So it's important to discuss these also in this context of the Human Rights Council. And I have a question for the panelists. I was wondering what's the role that you foresee for the precautionary principle as a legal tool, as a legal principle recognized in national regulation or international instruments to deter or at least prolong the development and implementation of these technologies until there's more scientific knowledge of the risks associated to them. So that would be one question I would have for you. Thank you.
Great, thank you for that question. Maybe we can take a couple. So I see Panama.
Thank you so much, Evie, and good afternoon, dear colleagues. First of all, I would like to thank the panelists for very good presentations. I know the topic it could be very difficult, very technical, but I think in a way that you explain it, make it very easy to understand its implications. Panama has been engaging in these discussions at the level of the advisory committee, and in the previous session we sustaining that the problem that we see with this type of technology, geoengineering, is that it does not address the root causes of climate change. And those that actually promote or invest in this type of technologies because they want to keep the status quo. They do not want to make an effort to go into the transition. And I think that it would be important to adopt a precautionary approach, such as is being taken in the framework of the CBD and also in IMO. And I just maybe want to ask a question, or maybe it's a question suggestion, because I think that it would be important to repeat a similar event when we are closer to the next session of the advisory committee, because I know that we are having this discussion at the margin of the council, but for a small delegation sometimes it's very difficult to engage in these many important events that are organized by our partners of civil society. But I think that having this type of discussion, getting closer to the session of the advisory committee, also help us to be better prepared when we have to engage whenever I think that for the next session probably we will have a draft report, right? And then we can maybe have can also encourage some delegations that have not been engaging in the process to maybe react to what it is, and also take into account important element that you have raised, for example, that the report refers to the climate protection technology, but it's not really an accurate reflection of what it is that we should be talking about geoengineering, and that's something that should be clarified in the report, regardless of what the resolution that is demanded says. That this is something that in the report the experts could clarify, and also the importance of maintaining a human rights-based approach, and also the integration of a gender perspective. But at the same time, one thing that we are always very cautious is not to portray something that is only brings benefit when there are well-documented information that the risks are greater than those benefits. And also another point that we are concerned about the technologies is, and it's not only this type of technology, that there's always a risk to use for this type of technologies for more malicious or hostile, let's say, use maybe against their own population. So this is something that I think that the report should reflect on. So that my question would be, are you considering maybe to repeat this kind of event? But if not, I highly recommend you to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Griselle. So I don't see any more. Okay, let's take one more question and then we can turn it back to the panelists.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the interesting panel. First of all, it's very interesting to see how we in history had similar debates with nuclear proliferation and so on. So I find it very interesting that we keep repeating this pattern of innovation and how regulations are a big issue. At the same time, I also feel that there is a big concern of a big population of the whole world left out in the decision making, where we have a huge concern of Western domination, or the domination of the countries with funds, developed countries, in even setting a forefront in creating these regulations, if regulations are created. So how do you think there can be a justified, evenly participated, universal standard created with regards to regulations involving all kinds of groups of people, all kinds of nations, with different inequality standards? So it's very hard to achieve that. So how do you think we can answer this big question? And thank you so much.
Great, thank you. And can you identify your organization?
I'm Shruti Lekha, and I'm here with Women's Federation for World Peace International.
Great, thank you very much. So we have 3 questions. One about the precautionary principle, one that addressed a number of reflections, including about the root causes of climate change, the benefits and risks of these technologies, as well as some procedural questions and suggestions about the best way to engage with the advisory committee, and then we have another question about participatory questions related to potential regulations. So let me turn it to whichever panelist would like to go first.
Is it on? Sorry, no. No. Sorry. Thank you for those questions and suggestions. On the precautionary principle, I think it's hugely important. It's also, by the way, it was one of the key principles and stumbling blocks that made negotiations at UNEA 4 in 2019 impossible on that issue. When Switzerland had made a submission and withdrew its submission, that was co-sponsored by many groups because they were not able to reach a consensus. And the precautionary principle was one of the things that was fought over. So I think it's a key issue when we look at governing, regulating, assessing risky, disruptive technologies, and geoengineering is amongst them. But there are others. Nuclear was mentioned, synthetic biology, new forms of genetic modification, etc. So there are other things that fall in that same category. I also want to say that some of the geoengineering proponents have been proactively talking about the precautionary principle, but turning it upside down, basically arguing, we know that the effects of climate change are going to be enormous. So it is our responsibility, in light of the precautionary principle, to research, develop geoengineering. I think that is very flawed, it's highly problematic, but that's what's being said in public spaces by geoengineering proponents, so just want to note that. To Panabat, thank you for that suggestion. I think we'll carefully consider how we can continue to engage and also offer more discussion spaces in light of this upcoming report. I think that the period between now and the first draft is also hugely important, seeing that the outline is already very biased and leaves very little space for the report to give a comprehensive picture of the topic. And I also appreciate you noting the terminology question again, because that is a key one. It is no coincidence that we see new terms popping up all everywhere, because it matters what you name a thing. And geoengineering is something that has a bad and risky flavor to it, so proponents have been trying to reclaim that space by renaming it. So you can find it under, climate intervention or climate restoration or new technologies for climate protection. It's very tricky to follow if they keep constantly renaming the thing when the thing doesn't really change. There is even just to mention that for a fun fact, there is a marine-based geoengineering technology that they've renamed as artificial whale poo to make it look nice and funny. And there is a real risk on weaponization. I did not mention that, but I should have. Thank you for raising that. Some of these technologies can be weaponized, and that is a risk that countries should be highly concerned about. Not all of them would be easy to weaponize, but some of them. And then there is that whole other sweep of technologies that are not geoengineering at global scale, but that are about weather modification. But they share a joint sort of history in terms of military research, and there is a gray zone where weather modification technologies become very large scale and might turn into geoengineering. And finally, on a universal standard of regulation, I think that's incredibly difficult to do, which for now I think leaves us with some of these technologies with the option of just arguing for a very prohibitive system, and including the solar geoengineering non-use agreement as a way forward, because there is simply no way, I believe, that we can find a way to benignly govern solar geoengineering in this world. I hope others can add to that.
Yeah, thank you. I won't get into the substance of what you said, Lily, because you're really the expert on that, but I really think it's important that we look at what has happened since this whole thing started, because as I said, it was a small paragraph that was introduced in the very big issue of having the special rapporteur on human rights and climate change. So in a way, this came up as a bit of like a side issue, and it was a bit surprising the way the advisory committee forced its way in through the back door. On the other hand, And it was great that the core group accepted it because it's totally legitimate to have a discussion on that. So we thought that, well, that's an interesting discussion, let's go and continue it. Unfortunately, we have a worry now when we see that at each step we have a problem. First, the way it started, but then this process has been totally disconnected from the discussion, for example, that has happened in UNEA, as it was very clearly said, and we see these are very important discussions, totally disconnected. Some of the most concerned states were not involved, and you see that they had no contribution. They probably didn't see it, it escaped them. But of course, if some of the main states who are today working on this issue are not involved in this process, we have another problem. We see that the special procedures who are concerned were not involved in the discussion at all, and there was no outreach to make sure that they are involved. We see, as I said before, but it's really problematic when a document is proposed to state which is misguiding them on the reality of a consultation. We see that indigenous people had no way to be authentically, genuinely participating in bringing their own issues. And we see that it's not a detail when we see that one of the very first attempts to try to, in a way, sneak in, to do an experience, was done on indigenous land. So it's really how we can use people in vulnerable situations, because we think we'll have a short way to go through. This is a clear human rights breach. So it's not a detail that indigenous peoples were not involved in the consultation. And then we see also that a lot of the scientists and the science-based organization, IPCC or IPBS, were not included in the process either. And then when you see the outline, and that's why we can already have an idea of what is going to be in the report, because the outline was already proposed this summer, a bit to our surprise. Let's not forget, on some of these issues, the advisory committee made research on 2, 3, 4 years. Here, just after, it's not even a year, just after you get the mandate, very quickly afterwards you get to the report on such a huge issue, without the proper consultation of all of the concerned parties. It is not acceptable for the human rights system, and it will be totally detrimental to the credibility of the human rights bodies if on such a light process we finally have a report that will be coming in. What we are very concerned now is to see that there is a use of the human rights bodies to curb the problems that they are meeting in other forums. And it's exactly to answer to your questions, how can we deal with the issue seriously? Well, by having connections between the different forums. There are the elements that we in the human rights system can bring in. You have the disarmament experience, which can be very useful. You have all the experience of CBD, which is not involved at all either. So we need a much more global approach to do this seriously, and so that we have a genuine human rights concern in how we're going to develop this. We cannot have very quickly a report done on such a light basis, and that would come out afterwards as an official report of the advisory committee to the Human Rights Council at the next session. This is dangerous for the issue, for the people, for human rights, for the human rights bodies. So this is really the concern we have, and I think it's very important that at the next meeting of the advisory committee, there is a clear decision for the sake of the advisory committee that they continue the research, they continue the consultation, they go much more in-depth, and they do not produce a report at the next meeting on the basis of what has already been said, because that's what they said. You have the outline, we like the outline, just publish it for the next meeting. This is absolutely not acceptable. It is dangerous for the whole process.
Yeah, thank you very much. As said, I am learning about these topics, but I am very interested by your question on the universal standard. I think that's a big problem, not only for geoengineering, that's a big political question, but I think that for this specific debate, it would be very good to have more states of those who you say have not very powerful voices to be engaged and to participate. We have experiences on other processes, and I think the issue of overcoming fragmentation that you mentioned is very important because there is a lot that has been discussed. So why not to take that into account? And finally, I want to say indigenous peoples were not involved, but also other rural movements were not involved, right? And that's a bit the reason why I was saying that we can connect to the processes in Rome, because rural movements are well organized in that forum. So they can also bring experience and their voices. We do not need to speak for them in the NGOs. They can themselves also give their opinions to states, and we hope that new states facilitate this as Panama suggested before and during the next consultations of the advisory committee. Thank you.
Thank you to all the panelists for their interventions. I think we're approaching time, so I think unless there are any burning questions, maybe just a couple reflections from me. Something that Grizel said about from Panama about what a busy time it is right now. With everybody reacting to crises and emergencies at the Human Rights Council. So I did want to thank everybody for actually making the time to come to this event. I realize it's a new issue for many, but hopefully it will have given you a sense of some of the important issues that are at stake in this developing topic. And while it's a new issue to many, there is work that has been done. So I think what we have up here is a link to some existing submissions and statements and existing materials on geoengineering. So do feel free to access those resources. Again, this is an ongoing process at the Human Rights Council. I think this is a matter of interest for a number of our organizations, and so we will all be continuing to watch this space. So with that, thank you very much for coming to the event, and we look forward to continuing to engage with you on this topic.